I should have stayed in bed. That thought struck me as I rubbed the cold sweat off my arms, sitting upright on the edge of my mattress. The room felt different, too still, too silent, as if the walls were holding their breath. My apartment smelled faintly of rain and stale coffee, the city outside humming through the thin windows, but it didn't feel like morning. Not really. I shook my head, trying to push the remnants of the dream away, but the images clung to me like damp cloth. I was running through a corridor lined with mirrors, endless and twisting, each reflection not quite my own. There were faces in the glass, not mine, not anyone I knew, staring with that impossible stillness. Their eyes, they weren't blinking. And when I reached out, my hand passed through the glass like smoke. A flash of panic made me stand. I rubbed my temples, hearing the faint echo of footsteps behind me, but the apartment was empty. I checked the hallway. Nothing. Only the light from the street lamp slicing across the floor, yellow and trembling. I wondered briefly if my mind was playing tricks, if sleep deprivation was finally catching up. But the feeling, that sharp, impossible sense of being watched, refused to leave. I went to the kitchen, hoping the cold sink water would anchor me back to reality. The faucet squeaked as I turned it on, splashing water over my face. When I looked up, the reflection in the window caught me off guard. A face, pale, perfectly still, glanced at me from the other side of the glass. Heart hammering, I blinked. Empty street. I blinked again. Gone. The dreams had been vivid before, sure, but never like this. Never tangible, like someone or something was crossing the threshold of sleep into my life. I sank into a chair, knees pulled to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. My journal lay open on the table, a half-empty pen beside it. I wanted to write, to capture the details before they dissolved like smoke, but my hand trembled too much. Even as I tried to reassure myself, the city outside seemed sharper somehow, more deliberate in its shapes and shadows. And I couldn't shake the sense that the night wasn't over. Not yet. That somewhere in the quiet cracks between dreams and waking, the faces were waiting, watching. I wanted to leave, to step outside, to shake the cobweb of terror off me. But something held me in place, some invisible tether to the nightmare that refused to end. I knew sleep would come again, and when it did, I didn't know if I would wake the same person. The next morning, the city felt off, like a painting slightly skewed on the wall. Even as I walked to the corner cafe, the sunlight seemed filtered, pale, suspicious. I tried to shake off the lingering residue of last night's dream, but it clung like a shadow, pressing at the edges of my mind. And then I saw it. A face. It wasn't my reflection this time. It was across the street in the glass of an empty boutique. Pale, motionless, staring straight at me. My stomach tightened as my eyes darted away, convinced I'd imagined it. But when I turned back, the figure was still there. A woman or something that looked like one, but her features were too symmetrical, too frozen, like someone had carved them from ice. I blinked and she was gone. I kept walking, heart hammering, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the feeling didn't leave. In the subway, the same thing happened. A man leaning against a pillar, expression blank, eyes fixed. He didn't move when the train arrived or when people crowded around. He simply waited. And when our eyes met, I felt it deep in my chest. A recognition, an accusation, or maybe a warning. I couldn't tell which. By afternoon, I started noticing them everywhere. In the reflection of a coffee shop window, in the steel of the office elevator, even in the crowd at the grocery store. Their eyes always met mine, always still, unblinking, heavy with some unreadable intent. I tried telling a colleague, describing what I saw, hoping for reassurance. She frowned, laughed nervously, and said I must be overworked. But the moment I looked up, across the office floor, there was that face again, peering from the glass partition. I left early, unable to stay another second. The sky had shifted to the gray of early evening, and I felt the pressure building in my chest. I wanted to run, to hide, but my body felt rooted to the cracked pavement, as though something unseen anchored me in place. Back in my apartment, I checked my journal. I needed to write it down before it slipped away, every expression, every detail. I drew the frozen eyes, the rigid lips, the impossible stillness. The pencil shook, but the image was exact. The faces weren't figments of dreams anymore. They were following me into the real world. And I realized with a sinking certainty, I wasn't just dreaming them. They were watching, learning, waiting. That night, sleep felt impossible. Every shadow held potential movement. Every flicker of light promised a new watcher. I curled beneath my blanket, ears straining for the slightest sound. Somewhere in the thin line between night and waking, I knew they were out there. Outside, behind glass, in reflections, waiting for me. And I could do nothing to stop them. I couldn't stop seeing them. Every reflection, every window, every glossy surface held their frozen gaze. I began to dread leaving my apartment, but even inside, the shadows seemed sharper, heavier, as if the walls themselves were watching. Sleep, or what was supposed to be sleep, had become a trap, a place where the impossible bled into my reality. Desperate for answers, I started keeping a dream journal. Each morning I scribbled details I barely remembered. The corridors that twisted endlessly, the mirrors that reflected faces that weren't mine, the feeling of cold, unblinking eyes. My handwriting shook, ink smudging as I pressed the pen too hard, trying to capture what was slipping from me even as I wrote. Then I began researching. I combed through forums about lucid dreaming, folklore, and urban legends. That's when I found it, references to dreamwalkers, entities that search for those who can see what should never touch the real world. They were said to move between dream and reality, hunting those whose minds were sensitive enough to notice them. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just a myth. The faces in the reflections, in the crowds, in the subway, they weren't hallucinations. They were aware, observing, and they were looking for me. I tried to test it. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, holding my breath, staring for minutes. Slowly, a face emerged behind mine, not in the reflection, but behind me, subtle, shimmering at the edges of my vision. I spun around. Nothing. Yet I knew it had been real, and the fear that I was being hunted tightened like a fist around my chest. The more I documented, the more they appeared. My journal became a map of terror. Each face, each detail, every slight movement in a reflection catalogued meticulously. Sometimes I swore I could see them moving in ways that defied logic, shifting slightly when I looked away, always returning when I looked back. I started hearing whispers too, soft, indecipherable murmurs when I tried to sleep. Not outside, not through the walls, inside my head. The voices carried the same icy stillness as their eyes, a cold curiosity, patient and knowing. I felt my mind stretching to contain it all, and sometimes I wondered if I was losing myself to the dreamscape I could no longer control. By nightfall, I knew one undeniable truth. These dreamwalkers weren't just part of my nightmares. They were stepping into the world I occupied, searching for me because I could see them. And the realization left me trembling, seated on the edge of my bed, staring at my own reflection in the window. Because tonight, I wasn't sure which reality I would wake into, or if I would wake at all. Sleep had become a dangerous territory. Each night, I fell into corridors that stretched endlessly, mirrors reflecting not me, but those faces, motionless, unwavering, observing. Sometimes I felt the walls close in, the ceilings drooping like wet canvas. My dreams weren't dreams anymore. They were places I was trapped inside, with no exit but the fragile thread of waking. The strangest part was how the real world began to bend. Shadows in my apartment lingered longer than they should, stretching toward me like living things. Streetlights flickered in impossible patterns. One evening, I walked past a cafe window and froze. The reflection of the street outside twisted unnaturally, bending in ways that should have been physically impossible. And in that distorted reflection, the faces were waiting, just as patient as always. I tried to ignore them, reasoning that awareness might make it worse. But the moment I looked away, I felt their gaze pressing into my back. One night, I thought I was alone in my apartment, but I heard the faintest footsteps pacing behind the bedroom door. I spun around, heart pounding. Empty. Yet I knew it had been real, whatever real meant anymore. Exhaustion began to take its toll. I barely ate, barely slept, and my reflection in the mirror seemed unfamiliar, stretched thin at the edges, tired and hollow-eyed. I started talking to myself aloud, documenting everything I saw and felt. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the reflection while writing, a subtle shift that didn't belong to me, and then a whisper, soft, distant, like a breeze brushing my ear. "We see you!" I ran through the apartment one night, clutching the journal, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood. The lights flickered, and when they steadied, I froze. The faces were there, not in mirrors this time, but standing at the edge of the kitchen doorway, unmoving, silent, each one impossibly still. My chest constricted, and I stumbled back, tripping over a chair, scrambling to escape. But no matter where I turned, the faces seemed to occupy every corner of my vision, always appearing the moment I tried to look away. I realized with a sinking certainty that they weren't bound by the physical rules I once trusted. They were patient, omnipresent, and I was running out of spaces to hide. Each night bled into day, each shadow bled into reality, and I began to fear even closing my eyes. Because somewhere in the border between sleep and waking, they were waiting, watching. And I understood. I was losing the ability to distinguish one from the other. I never thought I could feel fear so intensely while standing still. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the journal to my chest, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside. The air was too still, the shadows too deep, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. And then I saw them. At first, I thought it was a trick of the dim light, a shadow stretching too long. But slowly, impossibly, a figure stepped from the corner of my room. It was humanoid, vaguely familiar, but its features were frozen in a way that defied life. Eyes wide, unblinking, lips pressed tight. It didn't move like a living person. It hovered, shifting slightly like smoke caught in a draft. I gasped, falling back against the bed. My heart pounded so loudly I thought they would hear it. But they didn't need to hear me. Their gaze pierced through the room, through me, as if they already knew every thought, every fear, every secret hiding behind my skull. And then I understood. They were here for me. It wasn't just a visit. It was an inspection. A claim. I tried to speak, but my throat was tight, words caught like broken glass. Another figure appeared, stepping silently from the far corner, and another, until the edges of my vision were filled with pale, frozen faces. All of them stared. All of them were patient. All of them were waiting. I wanted to flee, to scream, to run anywhere, but my body refused. I could barely lift my hands, could barely blink without feeling their gaze burn into my skin. It was then that the whispering began, soft, collective, a murmur that seemed to reverberate inside my skull rather than the air around me. "You see us! You know us! You are ours!" I shook violently, trying to rid myself of the sense that I was being claimed, that somehow I had already been marked. But the words weren't threats. They were statements of fact, as though I had stepped into a world where my own awareness made me a target. I realized then that these dreamwalkers weren't bound by the laws of the waking world. They could slip through shadows, appear and disappear at will, manipulate reflections and perceptions. And I was their focus, their quarry. I had always known my dreams were intense, vivid, unusual, but I had never imagined they were a signal, a beacon. For hours, I sat paralyzed, watching them shift in the corners of my room, their silent presence pressing into my chest. When the first rays of dawn sliced through the curtains, they began to fade, melting back into shadows as if they had never been there. But I knew differently. They were still out there, always watching, always waiting. By the time I stepped outside, daylight felt fragile, unreal, like a thin film stretched over a deeper darkness. Every passerby, every reflection in a window, Every glimmer of movement made my chest tighten. I knew that no matter where I went, no matter how fast I ran, they would follow. My awareness had bound me to them, and somewhere deep inside, I feared the night more than death itself. Because soon, the boundary between my dreams and this world wouldn't just blur, it would vanish completely. By now, I was no longer sure what was real. The apartment had begun to shift around me in ways that made no sense. Walls seemed to breathe, stretching and contracting as if they were alive. The floor sloped in imperceptible angles, tilting just enough to make my steps wobble, and the hallway behind me seemed to stretch into infinity. I could hear the faint echo of footsteps, soft and deliberate, even though the space was empty. Outside, the city had changed too. Streetlights flickered in impossible rhythms, casting shadows that moved independently, curling and bending toward me. Reflections in shop windows weren't consistent with reality. They sometimes showed streets I had never walked, alleys that twisted unnaturally, and always those faces. They watched from the glass, from puddles, even from the darkened corners of alleys. Each time I looked, I felt their attention drilling into me, patient and unrelenting. I tried to leave, thinking that distance might give me safety. But the streets refused to remain familiar. Each turn I took led me back to the same intersection, the same shattered street lamp, the same cafe window where their eyes waited. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized I was trapped, not by walls or doors, but by perception itself. Every path I followed seemed preordained, a labyrinth designed by forces beyond comprehension. At home, I attempted to barricade myself. I shoved furniture against doors, draped sheets over mirrors, even taped the reflective surfaces I could not cover. Yet the shadows seeped beneath the cracks, pooling like ink, and I could feel their gaze pressing through the barriers I tried to create. My journal, once a lifeline, now felt like a tether, anchoring me to a reality that had lost all meaning. Sleep came inevitably, despite my fear, and the dreams, if I could still call them that, were worse than ever. The corridors were no longer just endless mirrors, they were alive, shifting with intent. Faces crowded the walls, crawling from one reflection to the next, following me, always staring, always patient. They whispered in voices that weren't voices, soft and sibilant, speaking words I could almost understand. The meaning was always clear. You belong to us. Sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of myself within the dreamscape, but not quite myself. Hollow-eyed, pallid, trembling, mirroring my fear. And I realized with a cold shock that the dream was learning me, cataloging my reactions, studying my patterns. Every attempt to resist only deepened its hold. I tried to contact someone, anyone, explaining what was happening, showing them the journal. But each conversation dissolved into confusion or disbelief. Friends, neighbors, coworkers, they saw nothing, heard nothing. I was alone, increasingly isolated, as if the very world was complicit in hiding these entities from everyone but me. By the fifth night, even the boundaries of my apartment were unreliable. Rooms stretched or shrank depending on where I looked. Doors led to impossible corridors. Windows reflected streets that didn't exist. I had lost count of how many faces had appeared in my waking hours versus my dreams. The line between them had completely blurred. I felt a presence constantly behind me now, always just out of sight, following. Each shadow, each flicker of light was heavy with intent. I understood, fully and finally, that there was no escape. Not from the city, not from the apartment, not from the dreamwalkers themselves. My awareness had marked me. My fear had bound me. And soon, whether asleep or awake, they would claim the entirety of my world. In the silence between moments, I heard it clearly, unmistakably. Their chorus of whispers, faint but omnipresent, threading through walls, ceiling, and floor, saying in unison, "You cannot hide, we are here." I realized then that the trap was not physical, it was perceptual, it was mental, and I was already caught. The night had begun like any other, but I knew, deep in my bones, that it would end differently. I could feel the weight of the city pressing down, heavy and unrelenting, as if the streets themselves had conspired to trap me. My apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a nexus of distortion. Hallways twisted in ways I couldn't predict. The ceiling hung lower in some places, higher in others, like a living organism shifting to accommodate my fear. Shadows pooled in corners and slithered along the walls, moving with intent. I was exhausted. Sleep had become a torment rather than a refuge, yet I could not avoid it. The moment my eyes closed, I was pulled into the familiar corridors of my dreams. Only this time, they felt different. The mirrors no longer reflected fragments of reality. They reflected the world as it truly was, a place where the dreamwalkers ruled, where the laws of physics and perception bent to their will. Their faces crowded the walls, silent and patient, their eyes piercing through me, understanding every thought, every heartbeat, every flicker of doubt. I ran through the endless halls, chasing a door I thought might lead to escape, but it only brought me to another corridor, another mirror. I could feel their attention on me, growing heavier, more insistent, as though the very air pulsed with their presence. Whispers echoed in my skull, insidious and unrelenting. "You cannot escape. You belong to us. You always have." And then, without warning, the corridors shattered. The dreamscape folded in on itself like a collapsing city. Mirrors cracked and spilled fragments of light and shadow, faces dissolving and reforming, endlessly multiplying. My reflection fractured into countless versions of myself, all trembling, all terrified, all aware that the boundary between the dream and waking world had vanished. I stumbled forward and felt the ground beneath me shift, tilting in ways that made me lose balance. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing in my apartment, but not my apartment. The walls were thinner, more translucent, as though the fabric of reality had grown fragile. The faces were everywhere. In the mirrors, the windows, the reflection of the polished floorboards. They didn't move, they didn't blink. They simply watched, always watching. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. My hands trembled as I reached for the journal, hoping for some anchor to reality, but the pages were blank. Or perhaps they had never existed. The familiar ink had vanished, leaving me with nothing but my fear and the oppressive certainty that I was entirely alone in my perception. A cold sensation crawled up my spine. One of the figures stepped closer, or perhaps I moved closer to it. It was impossible to tell, because in this space, movement was meaningless. Its eyes met mine, wide and patient, and I understood with a crushing clarity. The dreamwalkers had arrived fully in my world. Not just watching, not just appearing, they were here. And I was theirs. The room, or the semblance of the room, seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a rhythm I could feel in my bones. The walls throbbed, the floor seemed to breathe, and the faces multiplied, pressing in from every surface. I realized that the entire city, the entire waking world, had begun to obey the laws of the dream. Reflections twisted, shadows moved against their light sources, and every surface became a potential window into the corridors where they waited. I tried to flee. I ran down the hallway, the apartment stretching endlessly, doors appearing and disappearing with every step. But no matter how far I ran, they were ahead of me, blocking my path, patient and immutable. And as I turned one corner, I saw the culmination of it all. The corridor from my first nightmare, the one I had thought existed only in sleep, had opened into my living room. Mirrors lined the walls, reflecting not just me, but them. Every face I had ever seen, every unblinking gaze, every impossible expression, was there. A vast, silent chorus observing, judging, waiting. I understood then that the boundary was gone. Dream and reality had converged, fused into a single, inescapable point. I was surrounded, enveloped, and utterly alone. My perception had marked me. My awareness had bound me. And the dreamwalkers, patient, silent, eternal, had claimed me. I felt their attention settle on me completely, a weight that pressed into every fiber of my being. My eyes met theirs in the mirrors, and for the first time I saw what they were not. Human. They were something older, something beyond comprehension, entities that existed in the liminal space between thought and perception, feeding on awareness, thriving on the boundary I had crossed. I tried to blink, tried to close my eyes, tried to wish myself elsewhere, but it was useless. They were already inside me, in my mind, in my senses, in the fragile membrane that separated my world from theirs. My body trembled uncontrollably as I felt my consciousness stretching, unraveling, folding into the rhythm of the corridors, the mirrors, the endless unblinking faces. And then, in the most intimate horror imaginable, I realized there was no waking, no escape. There would never be. The dreamwalkers were everywhere in everything, and I was one of them now, forever caught between sight and shadow, between the known and the impossible, between sleep and waking. The mirrors reflected my face one last time, pale, hollow, eyes wide. And in that reflection, I understood fully, I would never be alone again.